There's a specific move worth naming directly, one genuinely distinct from both extremes almost everyone eventually tries. The dramatic block, or the exhausted begging that follows when the block eventually breaks. Today, we're tracing this specific move, cold in the sense of genuinely, completely unheeded by any remaining charge toward him, and considerably more powerful than either extreme because it requires nothing from him at all, not even the acknowledgement his blocking would demand or the response his begging would seek. Let's start with understanding why both blocking and begging, despite looking like opposite responses, actually share the same underlying limitation worth examining directly. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about what narcissistic psychology actually depends on for stability. Blocking, when it functions as reaction rather than genuine boundary, still requires him to register as significant enough to warrant this dramatic countermeasure. It's a decisive act, but it's still an act oriented entirely around his presence, his behavior, his continued relevance in your life. Begging, obviously, orients even more directly around him, seeking his response, his understanding, his eventual return. Both extremes, despite their apparent opposition, share this same fundamental structure. Your behavior organized in direct relation to him, whether that relation takes the form of urgent removal or urgent pursuit. The cold power move, complete genuine redirection of your entire life towards something that has nothing to do with him whatsoever. This isn't blocking, though it might eventually include blocking as one practical component. It isn't ignoring him in the dramatic performed sense that still requires ongoing effort to maintain. It's something considerably more comprehensive, connecting directly to everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about starving a narcissist through genuine abundance redirected elsewhere. You don't block him as an act of defiance. You don't beg him as an act of desperation. You simply completely stop organizing your life around his presence or his absence at all, treating the entire question of whether to block or beg as increasingly irrelevant to a life that's genuinely moved past requiring either response. Here's why this specific move produces effects considerably more devastating to narcissistic psychology than either dramatic extreme, connecting to everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about how his stability depends on some form of continued relevance, whether positive or negative. Blocking still confirms relevance. It's a decisive, energetic response to his presence, requiring him to matter enough to warrant this specific action. Begging obviously confirms relevance directly. What we're describing today confirms nothing at all, because it doesn't actually respond to him in either direction. It simply proceeds, entirely independent of whatever he's doing, saying, or attempting. Here's what this looks like in concrete, practical terms, because understanding the specific behavior matters considerably more than understanding the concept abstractly. If contact arrives, you might respond briefly and factually if practical circumstances genuinely require it, or you might simply not respond at all, not as a dramatic statement, but because your attention is genuinely elsewhere, engaged with something considerably more significant to your own life. If you happen to encounter information about him through whatever channel, you notice it with the same passing, minimal attention you'd give information about someone genuinely unconnected to your life, then return immediately to whatever you were actually doing. Here's the crucial distinction worth understanding directly. This cold move doesn't require you to actively resist the urge to block or beg through ongoing willpower. It requires something considerably different. Genuine disinterest that makes the entire question feel increasingly beside the point. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between performed detachment, requiring ongoing effort to maintain, and authentic detachment, developed through genuine internal work until it requires no active maintenance at all. This cold power move represents the practical manifestation of exactly this authentic version, distinguished from performed coldness by its genuine absence of underlying charge, rather than its surface appearance of calm. Here's why this proves considerably more powerful than dramatic blocking specifically, connecting to something we discussed extensively throughout our conversation about narcissistic obsession during no contact. Remember what we traced about how his psychology often interprets blocking as evidence of continued emotional investment, something requiring eventual circumvention through whatever indirect channels remain available. The mutual friends, the new social media accounts, the various workarounds we've examined throughout this entire series. Blocking, precisely because it represents a decisive, energetic act, sometimes paradoxically signals exactly the kind of ongoing emotional charge his psychology reads as worth eventually challenging or working around. Genuine, cold redirection offers nothing to challenge or work around, because there's no decisive act to circumvent, no dramatic boundary to eventually test or breach. It simply presents complete, ongoing evidence that you've genuinely thoroughly moved on, in a way that removes even the implicit confirmation of relevance that blocking, despite its protective function, sometimes inadvertently provides. Here's why this proves considerably more powerful than begging specifically, though this comparison likely requires less explanation given everything we've traced throughout this entire series about why begging consistently fails. Begging hands him exactly what his psychology depends on: direct confirmation of your continued need, your continued investment, your continued availability as a source of exactly the validation and engagement his stability requires. Cold redirection offers the complete opposite: genuine evidence that whatever need or investment once existed has authentically, permanently redirected elsewhere, offering nothing his psychology can work with, regardless of how sophisticated or how persistent his subsequent attempts might become. Let's trace what actually happens once this cold power move is genuinely, authentically sustained, because understanding the specific psychological consequence reveals why it produces effects considerably beyond what either dramatic blocking or exhausted begging could ever achieve. Here's the first thing that happens, connecting directly to everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about narcissistic obsession during no contact. Remember what we discussed about his psychology's usual expectation that either dramatic action or dramatic pursuit typically indicates something requiring his active response. Genuine cold redirection offers neither, which means his usual interpretive framework, reading blocking as challenge, reading begging as opportunity, finds nothing to actually work with. This produces a specific, considerable disorientation worth understanding directly. He's encountering something his psychology has genuinely no established category for processing, because it doesn't fit either of the two responses his experience has taught him to expect and successfully navigate. Here's the second thing that happens, connecting to something we traced extensively throughout our conversation about the 7 stages of narcissistic collapse. Remember the proximity testing we examined in detail, the casual social media engagement, the indirect check-ins through mutual connections, all designed to test whether the door remains open without requiring direct exposure to potential rejection. Genuine cold redirection, precisely because it doesn't involve the dramatic blocking that would prevent this testing entirely, often allows this testing to continue unimpeded, while simultaneously producing something considerably more disorienting than blocking ever could: complete, genuine absence of any response to this testing whatsoever. Neither the anxious engagement his psychology hopes to eventually provoke, nor the decisive rejection blocking would provide. Here's why this specific combination, accessibility without response, produces such profound psychological effect, connecting to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how his stability depends on producing some form of reaction. Remember what we discussed about how even his rejection through blocking provides a form of confirmation, evidence that you cared enough to take decisive action. Genuine cold redirection removes even this confirmation, offering something his psychology has considerably less capacity to process. Continued technical accessibility paired with genuine, complete absence of the emotional charge that would make this accessibility meaningful to his strategy in any way. Here's the third thing worth understanding about this specific dynamic, connecting to everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about attention versus love. Remember what we established about how his psychology requires continuous engagement, whether positive or negative, in order to maintain a sense of significance. Cold redirection, precisely because it offers neither positive nor negative engagement, produces something considerably more comprehensive than simple rejection: genuine, complete irrelevance. The specific psychological state we traced extensively throughout our conversation about why narcissists fear indifference more than anger or hatred ever could. Here's what's crucial to understand about why this specific combination proves so much more effective than either dramatic extreme at producing genuine, lasting psychological consequence. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about predictive competence and its collapse. Blocking, however protective, still fits within his existing predictive model. A decisive action he can eventually work around through the various indirect strategies we've examined throughout this series. Begging obviously fits within his predictive model perfectly, confirming exactly what his previous experience has taught him to expect. Cold redirection fits within neither category, which means it produces the specific, comprehensive predictive failure we traced extensively throughout our earlier conversation. The genuine crisis of confidence that develops when nothing in his accumulated experience prepares him for exactly this specific, non-reactive response. Here's something worth understanding about a specific advantage this move provides that neither blocking nor begging offers. It doesn't require you to make a single decisive choice you might later need to reverse or reconsider. Remember what we've traced throughout this entire series about the exhausting cycle many people experience: blocking, then unblocking out of guilt or curiosity, then blocking again in renewed resolve. Cold redirection sidesteps this entire exhausting cycle because it was never actually a decisive act requiring maintenance or reversal in the first place. It's simply the natural, ongoing consequence of your own genuine, complete redirection toward your own life, which means there's genuinely nothing to reverse, nothing to reconsider, nothing requiring the kind of decisive action that blocking and unblocking both inevitably involve. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply an analysis of psychological effect without addressing what genuinely matters most: how to actually cultivate this specific move authentically, and why treating it as a technique to actively deploy risks undermining the very quality that makes it powerful in the first place. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something we've navigated throughout several previous conversations in this series, and that deserves specific emphasis here. This cold power move cannot actually be performed convincingly before it's genuinely, authentically true. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narcissists remaining remarkably skilled at detecting the underlying need hiding beneath even sophisticated strategic calm. If you attempt to perform this specific coldness while secretly still hoping for a particular reaction, secretly still tracking whether it's working, secretly still oriented around producing the exact disorientation we traced throughout Part 2, you've transformed something genuinely powerful into exactly the kind of performed detachment this entire series has repeatedly identified as ultimately ineffective. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that offers a practical way to check whether your own current state genuinely matches what we've described throughout today's conversation, or whether it remains performance requiring conscious maintenance. If contact from him arrives, and your first honest internal response involves any calculation about how to respond in order to appear appropriately cold or appropriately indifferent, this suggests the redirection remains partial rather than complete. If instead your honest internal response involves genuine, minimal interest, the same kind of passing attention you'd give any other minor interruption to whatever you were actually doing, this suggests the authentic version we've traced throughout this entire conversation has genuinely taken root. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that connects directly to everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about starving a narcissist through genuine abundance. This cold power move, understood correctly, was never actually about producing a specific effect in him at all, despite how satisfying it might be to understand the mechanism through which it happens to accomplish exactly that. It's simply another expression of the same genuine, complete redirection this entire series has traced across dozens of conversations under various names: detachment, indifference, starvation, and now, this specific cold power move. Each framing offers a slightly different lens on the same underlying reality: your own life, genuinely and completely reclaimed, requiring nothing further from him in order to feel whole. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about the specific relief this understanding offers, distinct from everything else we've traced throughout this entire series. If you've spent considerable time cycling between blocking and begging, exhausted by the ongoing decision-making both extremes require, understanding that a third option exists, one that doesn't demand active, ongoing maintenance the way either dramatic extreme does, offers something genuinely valuable: release from the exhausting cycle of decision itself. You're not choosing, moment to moment, whether to block or whether to respond. You're simply, increasingly, living a life where this choice becomes genuinely, structurally, less relevant with each passing day, requiring less and less conscious attention as genuine redirection continues deepening. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. The cold power move we've traced throughout today's discussion works better than blocking or begging, not because it's a cleverer strategy, not because it's more sophisticated psychological warfare, but because it's genuinely, authentically not a strategy at all. It's simply what happens naturally, inevitably, once your own healing has progressed far enough that neither blocking nor begging feels necessary anymore, because the underlying orientation, both extremes, depend on active, ongoing relationship to the question of his presence in your life, has genuinely, completely dissolved. You don't need to master this specific move through deliberate practice, the way you might practice a particular boundary-setting phrase or a particular response technique. You need to continue doing exactly what this entire series has traced across dozens of conversations: the grief work, the rebuilt self-trust, the genuine redirection toward alternative sources of meaning, until one day, without any specific identifiable moment of transition, you notice that the entire question of whether to block or beg has simply, quietly stopped mattering, replaced by a life so genuinely full and so genuinely your own that his continued presence or absence in it has become, at last, completely, permanently beside the point. There's one more dimension worth adding here, because it addresses something practical many people wonder about once they've genuinely absorbed everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. What's the actual, realistic timeline for developing this specific state? And is it reasonable to expect it to arrive relatively soon? Or does understanding the concept accurately mean accepting that it might take considerably longer than feels comfortable to hear? This question deserves honest examination rather than false reassurance in either direction. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about genuine psychological change requiring sustained practice over real, often considerable time, rather than arriving through a single decisive shift once understanding has been achieved. The cold power move we've examined throughout today's conversation typically doesn't develop quickly, particularly if the relationship involved significant duration or significant investment. Someone who spent years in a relationship characterized by exactly the patterns this entire series has traced extensively shouldn't expect this genuine, authentic coldness to develop within weeks of separation, regardless of how thoroughly they've absorbed the intellectual understanding this conversation provides. Here's what's worth understanding about realistic markers of progress along this timeline, rather than expecting the complete final state we've described to arrive all at once. Early progress often looks like noticing the urge to block or the urge to beg arising, and then consciously choosing neither, even while this choice still requires genuine active effort to sustain. This effortful stage represents genuine movement, even though it doesn't yet match the effortless natural quality we've traced throughout this entire conversation as the eventual, authentic destination. Middle progress often looks like these urges arising less frequently, requiring less active effort to redirect when they do arise. Later progress, the stage we've primarily described throughout today's discussion, looks like the urges themselves becoming increasingly rare, replaced by genuine minimal interest that no longer requires any conscious management at all. Here's something worth understanding about a specific risk worth naming directly, one that connects to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series regarding self-compassion during difficult stages of healing. If you find yourself still experiencing the urge to block or the urge to beg, even after considerable time has passed, this doesn't indicate failure or evidence that you're somehow doing healing incorrectly. It indicates simply and honestly that you're currently somewhere along a genuine, realistic timeline that varies considerably from person to person, depending on factors including the relationship's duration, its specific severity, and the particular resources and support available to you throughout your own healing journey. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, one that addresses something important about how to relate to yourself during whatever stage of this process you currently honestly occupy. Rather than measuring your progress against the complete, effortless coldness we've described as the ultimate destination throughout today's discussion, consider measuring it instead against your own previous state, tracking genuine, incremental improvement rather than comparing your current experience against some idealized, fully arrived endpoint that might still be considerable time away. This matters because the alternative, why holding yourself to the standard of complete immediate coldness before you've genuinely had time to develop it authentically, risks producing exactly the kind of performed detachment we've cautioned against throughout this entire conversation, forcing an appearance of coldness that hasn't actually developed internally, which typically proves considerably less effective and considerably more exhausting to maintain than genuine, gradual progress toward the authentic version this conversation has traced. Here's a final thought worth carrying forward from everything we've examined throughout this entire conversation, one that ties together everything this specific piece has explored. The cold power move that works better than blocking or begging was never actually a technique waiting to be discovered and deployed. It's simply an accurate name for where genuine, complete healing eventually, naturally arrives, described here specifically through the lens of how it affects someone whose entire strategy depends on exactly the reactivity this state removes. Understanding this accurately protects you from two equally unhelpful extremes. Expecting this state to arrive immediately through simple decision and believing that its gradual, sometimes slow development somehow indicates failure rather than genuine ongoing progress. You're not failing if you're not there yet. You're simply somewhere along a path this entire series has traced across dozens of conversations, moving, gradually and genuinely, toward a state where the question of how to respond to him, block, beg, or anything in between becomes increasingly naturally irrelevant, replaced by a life so genuinely full and so authentically your own that this specific question, however urgent it might currently feel, will eventually quietly stop requiring your attention at all.